Okay. Hello. Thanks for coming. If you saw John Buckman's talk just before me, we, I guess, had similar ideas that since this is a Linux conference and we are involved in open media, why not give a talk about, in part, how free software and free content relate to each other. There's actually going to be pretty little overlap between our talks. And I'm sorry that he didn't come after me so I could recommend him. But so my name is Mike Linksvayer. I work for Creative Commons. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Creative Commons just in case there are people who don't know what that is. And the picture you see on the first slide is licensed under a Creative Commons attribution license, which means that you can do whatever you want with it as long as you give credit to the photographer. And this was taken by In-Case Designs, which I guess is a company, and it's a picture of a lug on a bike. So I guess you can guess what my last slide is going to have on it. So table of contents for this talk, a little bit about Creative Commons, how are software and culture or cultural artifacts different and similar, a little bit about freedom in those contexts, some history, some indicators of how far along we are in both fields, and then ways we can help each other. And by the way, the title of this talk is How Far Behind is Free and Open Culture? And by that I mean, of course, how far behind free and open source software is it? So Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization. We've been around about 5 years. We're actually headquartered 2 blocks from here. I guess you can't see the building, but we also have a Science Commons division in Boston. We work with our international network primarily of legal experts to make sure our licenses work around the world. That work is headquartered in Berlin. We get funding from foundations, corporations, and also individuals. The basic mission is to enable more reasonable copyright. So there's a space between ignoring copyrights on one hand and ignoring fair use and the public good on the other. So we have legal and technical tools that enable a some rights reserved model. It's like free software, open source, but for content and media. However, the caveats are that we have more restrictive options than are available in free software and open source. And also media is just more diverse, and I conjecture at least a decade behind software. So you can visualize kind of the Creative Commons options as they relate to the free and open source options. And the green circle in this diagram has our attribution and share alike properties that are options in our licenses. And those are okay within the free and open concepts that are embraced by free and open source. We also have no derivatives and non-commercial options, which are outside of the scope of the spirit of free and open source. Because the no derivatives option does not allow you to modify the work. Non-commercial does not allow you to use the work commercially. So those combine in non-mutually exclusive ways to make 6 different licenses. The top 2, attribution and attribution share alike, are in the spirit of free and open source software, but are meant to be applied to content. The bottom 4 are more restrictive, either restricting commercial use or derivative works or both. So some of the things we provide around the licenses, we have the licenses themselves, which are just written for lawyers, and we also, as I mentioned, work with our international network of legal experts. One of the things that we do is have them help translate linguistically, but also legally, to use terminology from the local copyright law in order so that when a case goes to court in the Netherlands, for example, a Dutch judge will be able to better understand the license and hopefully make it more likely that they'll consider the license valid. Then we also have a human-readable version. This is also the Dutch version of that, but we have it in many different languages. So at a high level, outlines what are the freedoms you get when using the license, when using a work under the license, and what are the restrictions you're operating under. So this is in Dutch, but it basically says, and I don't read Dutch, but I know that the English version says that you're free to share and remix the work as long as you give credit, don't make commercial use of the work, and if you make a new work based upon this work, you have to share it under the same license. So this is one of the 6 licenses that we offer. So then we also offer what we call a machine-readable version of those licenses, which basically says in a way that the machines can understand what are the properties associated with that license. And then also when you publish a work, you can publish metadata with the work to facilitate finding and reuse of that work. And this is contrasted with digital rights management, which is basically describing the work such that software can control what you can do with it. So they're basically very opposite use cases. And here's a nice little cartoon or a detail of a large poster about the current digital media landscape. This detail is called DRM Voodoo, and it's under a CC license, attribution license. And some recent changes with CC. We're now 5 years old, as I mentioned. We just have a new CEO. Our founder, Lawrence Lessig, is transitioning into doing work fighting corruption in the political space. You may have read about that, called Change Congress. We have a new general counsel who comes by way of Mozilla and the open source OSDL, Open Source Development Labs, where Linus Torvalds is, and is also on the board of the Software Freedom Law Center. So I think this is a great time for us to start collaborating more with the open source and free software world. We have a new very lightweight license, which is now in development, called CC0, which is basically a way to waive all rights you have associated with the work. So you don't even require attribution. And then we have a new division called CC Learn, which is basically focused on spreading open practices and open licensing in education, which is a very natural fit, but we decided in order to pursue the opportunity there, we needed some people who are dedicated to speaking that language. And we got some funding from the Hewlett Foundation to do that. So now on to the main part of the talk. And if that wasn't a good intro to Creative Commons, I'm happy to take questions about it or talk offline. That's basically what we do. So I'm going to draw some comparisons, distinctions between software and culture, which will get to kind of some of the different strategies we employ and complementary strategies we deploy in pursuing an open culture as opposed to an open software. So one thing is that for software, the reuse case is very utilitarian and obvious, but it's also very narrow. So an example is that using Gecko, the HTML renderer, in different browsers and in different contexts, that in different programs that need a browser, that's incredibly obvious and is done a lot, not just with Gecko, but also WebKit and on the Windows platform, whatever the IE renderer is called. But that's pretty narrow. Most code can't be reused with most other code, even though when reuse is possible, it's pretty obvious. A random example of that is device driver code and code that's in a web application. There's just no case for putting those together and reusing them together. I mean, except as different layers in the application stack. But for art or cultural artifacts, content, media, whatever you want to call it, pretty much anything can be mixed together. And just as a random example of that, you have some cat photos and some heavy metal music. Well, you can make a music video from that. Another difference between software and culture is that with software, maintenance is necessary, whereas with culture, it's relatively rare. Non-maintained software is basically dead software. It's not going to get in the next distribution. Whereas a maintained cultural work is a pretty special work, either incredibly popular that's always getting built upon and repurposed, or special types of collaborative projects that are more like software in some senses, like wikis are the best example of that. Another very closely related difference between software and culture is the modifiable form, which is very important for software licensing. You need the source code. Software is pretty much all or nothing. Either in a compiled language, you really want the source code because the object code is really, it's not quite useless for building upon the software, but it's pretty close to that. Or in the scripting language, then the modifiable form is actually what you run. As opposed to with culture, the source forms are varied and very degradable. In other words, even if you don't have the optimal form for reuse, it might still be useful. An example of that would be text with markup is optimal. You have all of the information, all of the highlighting notes that have been made by the author, etc. PDF is a lot less useful, but you still, if it's not a scan, you at least have the text, you have fonts and stuff. A bitmap scan is a lot less useful, but you could still even OCR it. In music, an example of that degradation would be multi-tracks is most useful, so you have all the individual component tracks already extracted out for you. You can use individual pieces of the music to make your own music. A high bit rate mixed down version of that is a lot less useful, but it's still pretty useful because it's high quality. You can extract tracks from that. It's basically not going to be as easy or quite as high quality as having multi-tracks available, but you can still reuse that content. Low bit rate is just lower quality, less useful for reuse, but you can still use it in some contexts. So basically, modifiable form is a lot less of an all or nothing proposition for culture. Then finally, also related to modifiable form, construction of software is basically identical to creating the modifiable form of the software. You create software, you create source code, and you build on that source code. You share that source code. Other people build on it. Whereas often production of culture involves iteratively leaving stuff on the cutting room floor, either literally or when you're making video, you might throw away a bunch of frames. You might, just because it's so big, and there can be so much source material, it might be impossible for the actual original author to go back to all of the source material and change the video because they might have thrown away a lot of it. So then that's all about some kind of differences in practice between software and culture, although I would love to have more examples if anybody wants to present any. So then what are the differences in terms of freedom between software and culture? With software, what we mean by software freedom has been pretty well defined in practice and in manifesto form. So we have the Debian free software guidelines, we have the open software definition, we have the free software definition, all of which say in different language pretty much the same thing. Then we have the preamble to the GPL, and there's a lot of lore that goes along with that. Everybody knows pretty much what it means. But there's not a lot of discussion about exactly why we want those freedoms when we talk about software. So briefly, some of the reasons why we want software freedom. There's user autonomy. If we don't have all of those freedoms, then you don't have control over the software you're running. And you could go through the different points of the open software definition, which John Buckman actually did just before, and talk about how each one of them, I think probably every one of them, furthers user autonomy in some form. There's a sharing ethic, but that's furthered by having software freedom. And then also more pragmatically, the different things required by software freedom facilitate collaboration, unlock value, and makes distributed maintenance tenable. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So then, does culture need freedom, and does it need the same freedom that free software does? There are certainly people saying that it does, and they have a pretty good story. Probably the best known of those is the definition of free cultural works, which is at freedomdefined.org, which is created primarily by Mako Hill, who's on the Free Software Foundation board, and Eric Moyer, who's works with the Wikimedia Foundation. And so it's a fairly long document that basically relates the 4 freedoms of software to the 4 freedoms or translates those 4 freedoms for software defined by the free software definition into the 4 freedoms required for culture. But basically, when it doesn't have a lot on why we need those freedoms. And a couple of sentences that do touch on that are the following, which I'll just read. The easier it is to reuse and derive works, the richer our cultures become. And then these freedoms should be available to anyone, anywhere, anytime. They should not be restricted by the context in which the work is used. That's not really a reason, and then the reason is creativity is the act of using an existing resource in a way that has not been envisioned before. So fundamentally, we need freedom for culture because it makes our culture richer, facilitates reuse. And we all want those freedoms to be available to everybody. I think a lot more work could be done on stating what the reasons we need free culture are. Another place to look is actually which references this, is the Wikimedia or Wikipedia content licensing guidelines, which talks about basically why, in the context of Wikipedia and Wikimedia projects, this kind of freedom is needed. So these are the 4 freedoms translated from the free software definition to terminology appropriate for culture. I won't read that, or I'll read the highlighted parts. So there's a freedom to use, freedom to study, freedom to make and redistribute copies, freedom to make changes and improvements. So as I mentioned, this definition of freedom, this kind of free software definition of freedom, has been applied most prominently in the Wikipedia and Wikimedia licensing policy. It's now explicitly, although at least 2 of the Creative Commons licenses have always fit this definition, Creative Commons is now explicitly recognizing this reciprocally, basically, because the definition of free cultural works explicitly says that these CC licenses are free cultural licenses. So we now note that on the human readable version of those licenses, there's a seal. If you can't read that, it says approved for free cultural works. That means that if you have a cultural artifact and you want it to be a free cultural work as defined by the definition of free cultural works, the licensing component of that will be taken care of if you release the work under one of these CC licenses that qualify. So Creative Commons also offers no derivatives and non-commercial options on its licenses, and those very obviously do not qualify as free in the spirit of free software. So why are those offered? Well, no derivatives might be an artifact of history. Basically, when CC was starting in 2002, the file sharing wars were still in full swing, or they were still somewhat of an open question, I guess. I mean, people are still getting sued, et cetera. But basically, they made mere sharing of verbatim works interesting legally, because people are getting sued for, and companies were getting shut down for enabling people to share verbatim works. So just giving people the permission to share works that you couldn't change seemed like an interesting step forward, basically, even though you can't build on those works. And it's basically a way for artists to say, I won't sue you. A lot of people aren't incredibly happy about this option. In fact, John Buckman earlier was just saying he doesn't think that if you use a license that says you can't make derivative works, it's an open license, period. Forget what further qualifications other definitions might say. And I have to admit, I'm not super enthusiastic when somebody says, I release something under a CC no derivatives work license, because that's cool. At least you're not going to sue anybody, but there's not going to be any building on top of that work. Probably the more significant option is non-commercial. So you can say you can't use this work for commercial purposes, which is controversial in two ways, basically. One is exactly what does that mean? Exactly what qualifies as commercial use? I personally don't think that's all that big of a problem, but a lot of people do. The other is just that it's a restriction on field of use, so it doesn't sit with freedom in the spirit of free software or in the spirit of open source. For whatever it's worth, a side note, why I don't think that's actually a big problem, maybe it's because my background is programming, and I take the kind of golden rule that you should be liberal in what you consume but conservative in what you produce. Kind of the way of relating non-commercial to that is, if you put stuff out under non-commercial, you should expect people are going to make uses that could be a little bit commercial. I mean, maybe there's an ad on their website that they're actually not making any money off of. If you're not okay with that, then you probably just might not want to use a CC license because you're actually being very protectionist. On the other hand, if you're wanting to reuse work and you think that you might qualify as commercial because you have ads on your website or whatever, just find content that does let you make commercial use, because there's plenty of it out there. So why might these particular freedoms, in particular non-commercial, be less, or the lack of these freedoms be less impactful on culture than software? Well, I think it boils down to there's less emphasis on maintenance. And as I mentioned before, non-maintained software is dead, whereas maintained culture is pretty special. So restrictions on field of use are a little bit less impactful, just because reuse is less continuous and there are fewer parties involved. It's actually possible if you want to reuse culture that isn't maintained, in other words, it's static, because there's usually only one creator or rights holder. So you can so Magnatune publishes music under a CC non-commercial license. You can actually, if you hear a Magnatune track you want, it's actually feasible to go to them and buy commercial rights to it, because you know exactly who owns it. Whereas if you have a situation where the content is being maintained by a bunch of people, it quickly becomes impossible to clear the commercial rights, which basically means that a non-commercial restriction means that the content is just not usable for commercial purposes at all. Then also, free commercial use might be more impactful on existing business models in the content space than they are in the software space. And that also probably relates to maintenance being more important for software, because there are a lot of programmers are paid just to maintain software, and licensing doesn't really even come into play. Whereas in their heads anyway, an awful lot of musicians are really tied to being able to sell recorded content. So the commercial anti-commons is what I was just alluding to a second ago about if you have content that's maintained by a lot of people with a non-commercial restriction, it quickly becomes unusable in commercial contexts. And anti-commons, I think the term originated from the time after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you had, buildings where ownership, may have been used they may have been used suboptimally in Soviet times, but then after the end of the Soviet Union, an apartment building might have been claimed by a whole bunch of people. So you actually had too many ownership claims, so it couldn't be used by anybody. And the case where you have a whole bunch of people who all are putting non-commercial restrictions on, basically all have non-commercial restrictions on content, basically means that content is impossible to clear for commercial uses. So anti-commons is kind of a fancy word to use for that. And I think this might, because when distributed maintenance is important, if you add too many restrictions onto the license, you get this kind of commercial anti-commons effect. I think that might be one explanation why free software in practice is basically equivalent to open source, even though open source is seen as kind of enabling business to make money, et cetera. In fact, if open source, and people have tried to get past open source, have tried to get the OSI to certify open source, software licenses that have further restrictions. But in fact, those further restrictions would actually be bad for business. So another a weird thing I've never heard anybody talk about, but I think it's kind of interesting, is that maybe some artists actually want a commercial anti-commons. They want no commercial use to be possible, period, because that means nobody can be exploited. And a lot of artists are kind of backbiting in that way. I probably shouldn't have said that, but I think that most artists probably aren't thinking quite that far ahead, although they might just see non-commercial and say, oh yeah, anti-capitalism, and not think any more than that. But if they had thought really far ahead, they might say, this creates an ecosystem where commercial use is impossible. But I think most artists probably just want to be able to exploit commercial uses, and there are cases where non-commercial allows you to do that, especially where you don't have works that are being contributed to by a lot of people. And that's basically the Magnitude case where you have somebody you can buy commercial licensing from. So then I also just note that there are some communities in which free as in free software might not be free enough. And Science Commons, which is our division focusing on kind of furthering openness in science, is making that case for data anyway. And they have a document called Protocol for Implementing Open Access Data, in which basically they say for scientific data, which is not copyrightable in the U.S., and there's a weird kind of para-copyright, I don't know if that's quite the right term, created by the Database Directive in Europe, that scientists should avoid any form of restrictions on scientific data, even things like attribution and share alike, because you might want to incorporate a whole bunch of databases about gene reactions, and you don't want to have to worry about whether the drug you're going to be creating is going to be governed by share alike, or whether you have to attribute every single scientist who have ever contributed to any of these data sets. So Science Commons has actually been one of the drivers for the copyright waiver we're creating, in the process of creating called CC0, which is basically waive any rights, and to be super clear, we're also waiving any database rights that might exist in the content. So this might be the last slide on freedom. Another, which is not really related to the others, but I think it's something extremely interesting that cuts across software and content, and that is the scope or strength of copyleft. The way copyleft works is that when somebody creates a new work based on another work, basically the deal is you can use the work as long as the new work is released under the same license. So that's why we call it the CC version share alike. It's share and share alike, basically. And the way that's worked has basically been to suck in a bunch of content into the free world that probably would not have been free otherwise. This has happened practically many times where somebody has incorporated some code under the GPL into their software and then released it, and then somebody says, hey, there's some GPL code in the software. you either have to take it out or license your software under GPL, which has meant that there's kind of a snowball effect of more and more code under the GPL. However, there are some cases where you might want to be more or less restrictive than the GPL, basically. And that's long been recognized in the software world. You have permissive software licenses like the BSD and MIT/X11 licenses, where maybe the creator of the software basically only wants adoption. Standards might be one example of that, where you want a standard adopted all over the place. You want it to be adopted in a proprietary software as well as in free software. So you don't want to put any restriction on that whatsoever. So that's basically the zero copyleft. You have LGPL, which the FSF is actually actively kind of discouraging. In fact, it was originally called the Library General Public License. After its proposed use case, is now called the Lesser General Public License. But that allows you to use copyleft code as a library in your code without having to copyleft your code. But if you make improvements to the library, you have to contribute it back. Then there's a GPL, which is the classic case. Then there's a very interesting one called the Affero GPL, which is brand new with GPL v3, or released a few months after it. Although there's an antecedent called the Affero license. And what that says is that if you expose an application over the network, then you have to release the source code. So basically, exposing code over the network is the same as distributing the code. A lot of people see a challenge to free software in web applications, basically meaning that I can download code, run it on my web server, make improvements, make a big business off of running that code, but never share the code back to the world. In the AGPL is one tactic being explored to apply copyleft to that kind of scenario. And there are probably a few dozen software packages that are now released under that. And I'm sure that there will be businesses using that as part of their business model going forward. However, so that's a long way of getting to the point where I want to say that for culture, the strength or scope of aggressiveness of copyleft is also a very interesting issue. And that basically is what constitutes an adaptation or derivative work that actually triggers copyleft. And this is controversial in some cases where you're using media very contextually, but you're not actually combining the work. So, for example, using a photo to illustrate an article where the photo is semantically very meaningful in the context of that photo. And that may or may not be, so that the article may or may not be a derivative work of the photo. There are some people who would like that to be the case. There's some people who think that would make photos under share alike practically useless. And so that may be something that Creative Commons addresses in a future version of our licenses. We already addressed one similar case, or we have since version 2.0 of the licenses, where we explicitly say that syncing audio with video creates a derivative work, such that if I have a song that's released under CC attribution share alike, I'm making a video for that song, meaning that I have video synced to that audio. I have to release the video under that same license. Then what should people be thinking about when they're making these decisions, either in the software world or in the content world, about how aggressive copyleft should be? And this is another thing that I think maybe people have in their head subconsciously but haven't thought through explicitly. Basically, if the goal is to expand the free software, assuming that's your goal, then optimal copyleft should be where the underuse opportunity costs, meaning when people don't use your code or your work because they don't like the requirements, so they don't create new work that also carries a copyleft provision. So that underuse opportunity cost cancels out the what I'll call the vacuum effect at the margin. So in other words, I think I'm probably repeating myself now, but copyleft has an effect of kind of sucking more content into the free world, or more code into the free world, because people are incented to license their code or content freely in order to take advantage of existing code. At some point, more aggressive copyright or more aggressive copyleft means that you'll simply get less stuff released, less new code released under copyleft, because reuse is too onerous. And just kind of a cartoon version of that, you could actually go a lot further than the AGPL and have copyleft the world, basically. If you run this code on your computer, or if you view this image on your computer, then everything on your computer has to be copylefted, or everything you've ever touched has to be copylefted. I mean, that's a very cartoon version of that, but
is that the CC Infinity license?
Great idea, good idea. If anybody ever licenses anything, then the game's over. So we should just do that. But well, that ignores copyright law, et cetera. But anyway, so now on to the next part of the talk about history. And this is really going to get at the title of my talk, which was how far behind free software is free content, or is it still behind? So I'm going to have a few different. I don't come to any good conclusions, but I'm going to throw up a bunch of data points. I would love to have people think more about this. So I don't want to say these are the key dates for software, but I think they're evocative anyway. 1983 was the launch of the GNU project. That's 25 years ago. And for the next 6 years, Stallman and other people were working on Emacs and GCC and some other infrastructure, or I guess you could call Emacs infrastructure. Developers use it anyway. But they were, up until that point, they were basically using one-off software licenses for each one. So in 1989, they published GPL v1, and all of the GNU project was under that license. 1991, the first versions of the Linux kernel were released, so was GPL v2. And those have basically set the standards for the next, until this date, basically. 1993, Debian started, which I think for the last 15 years, basically, Debian is the most interesting social phenomenon in the world, although maybe now Wikipedia is. And also very interesting in terms of how software gets built and packaged, et cetera. 1996, Apache was started, or at least formally. There had actually been the patches to NCSA before then. 1998 was a big year. Mozilla, the Netscape source code was released at the beginning of the long road towards Mozilla. The open source term was coined. I believe that was directly related to the release of the Netscape source code. Basically, people were thinking about how should we think about this new opportunity, and they came up with the term, and make it business friendly. The term open source was coined. IBM also started its huge commitment to free and open source at that time, and a lot of other big companies have since then. Of course, in the 1999 timeframe, we have lots of craziness, open source IPOs, et cetera. And since then, it's really difficult to pick out any dates that are really important because there are so many amazing things happening. But 2004, Firefox 1.0, 6 years after the original Netscape codebase was released. In 2007, who knows how important it will be, but GPL v3 and AGPL were released. Who knows when world domination is going to come. So then some history on the open content side, which is probably a lot less well-known. First of all, from the perspective of open content licenses, some of them which are free. 1998, David Wiley, who's a professor of education, I believe, at basically studying open and electronic e-learning, that sort of thing, at Utah State University, produced the first open content license called the Open Content License. A year later, he produced the Open Publication License. These are mostly forgotten and very confused with each other, although they're extremely different licenses. Open Content License was actually a copyleft license. Open Publication License was the license with options, one to restrict commercial publication, print publication, and other to restrict derivative works. And then in 2000, we had the first version of the GFDL. We had the first version of the Free Art License, which is probably the first license, and those are both copyleft licenses. Free Art License is actually the art license Art Libre, I think, if French. But I think it's probably the first license explicitly targeted at art as opposed to content generally. In 2001, we had the FF Open Audio License that the FF, I remember it, but I don't recall exactly the messaging around it, but I have to imagine it was kind of in response to everything going around file sharing and EFF being very involved in those battles and wanting to create kind of a voluntary legal alternative. So then there are a whole bunch of other early open content licensing experiments in the early 2000s. Most of them perhaps never used other than the license being published, but not quite that bad. But some of them were design science license, Ethymonics. I think I have a spurious comment there. I think it's the Ethymonics Free Music Public License. Open Music Green, Yellow, Red, and Rainbow licenses, Open Source Music License, No Type License, Public Library of Science Open Access License, Electro Hippie Collective's Ethical Open Documentation License, and I'm sure there were others. So then Creative Commons came on the scene. There was pre-work done in 2001, but it was released in late 2002, the first version. We've had a few versions since then. One important thing to note is that there's been some license non-proliferation, I guess you would call, or authors of previous open content licenses basically recommending use Creative Commons instead. In 2003, David Wiley, the open content and open publication license guy, recommended using CC. Public Library of Science, which is an incredibly important open access publishing venture, adopted the CC attribution license and has really been a spearhead in the open access movement. In 2004, EFF released version 2.0 of its open audio license, which is basically just says CC attribution share alike is the next version of this license. So then mentioning, I have a semi-duplicate slide here. Anti-proliferation. So I guess another thing to note here is that there really haven't been any significant new cultural licenses since Creative Commons was launched. One minor thing to note, which I don't have on the slide, is that the BBC created a license called the Creative Archive license in 2005, which was roughly based on the most restrictive CC license. They added yet another restriction, which basically said you can only use this content in the United Kingdom. So not very useful to very many people, because basically it said people in the United Kingdom could copy the content, which I guess is better than getting sued in the United Kingdom, but isn't all that interesting. And they don't seem to have done anything on that since the initial experiment. 2008, there could be could bring the most important development here. There's a possibility that Wikipedia, in working with Creative Commons and the Free Software Foundation, will enable Wikipedia to migrate from the free documentation license, which is really optimized for software documentation, to the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license, which is our copyleft license. So that's the end of the history part. That might give you some context of where open content is relative to free and open source software. And I guess I have about 10 minutes. So what are some So what are some indicators we have as to how far along we are? Well, in 1993, Debian started. In 2001, Wikipedia started. I think those are by far the most interesting kind of massively collaborative software and content projects. So Wikipedia is 8 years after Debian. It's also, but I think there are a lot of differences. One, Wikipedia's success came much more quickly and more visibly. And I don't know if Wikipedia even needs an Ubuntu. Debian people might be offended to think they needed an Ubuntu, but I think it's clear that Ubuntu spread Debian much more widely, but Wikipedia is already spread more widely. But I think, so that might give the appearance that, in fact, free content is going to rocket past free software because Wikipedia is this practically overnight success versus Debian's been going for 15 years. I mean, it's an incredible success, but hasn't taken over the world in the way that Wikipedia is really, really impacted encyclopedias and is, much more than any encyclopedia ever was. But I'm not sure how typical Wikipedia is of free culture, really. In some ways, it's more like a software project because of the maintenance aspect that I was talking about a lot before. So some business indicators, kind of Cygnus Solutions, which was created to maintain GCC and some other software and provide software around that, was for many years was kind of the paradigmatic free software company. It started in 1989, was eventually acquired by Red Hat in 1999, and the founder of Cygnus is now the CTO of Red Hat, I believe. Magnitude is probably the most frequently cited open content business. In fact, John Buckman just gave a talk an hour ago. They started in 2003. So that's a 14-year difference. Magnitude's long-term impact is to be determined whether it will blow up or continue to be successful. We just don't know at this point. The other caveat is that while Cygnus was very clearly a free software business, they only worked on free software. Magnitude may not be free enough for many people, but I think it's the best analogy at this point. So then other indicators, big business, 1998, IBM made a big commitment to free software. There really haven't been any analogous huge company investments in free culture. Another big business analogy might be, or we might want to think about whether this is the case, is Microsoft's attitude towards free software in 1998 roughly equivalent to big media's attitude towards free culture in 2008? Maybe, maybe not. Another indicator, which I'm not going to try to make an analogy to free software, Wikitravel is a cool success story that's round trip, basically. It's a Wikipedia-like site that is building travel guides. So they're focused only on, rather than having an entry for a city that talks about its history, et cetera, et cetera. It talks a little bit about that, but it's focused on the kind of content you have in a travel guide. They're using a CC attribution share-alike license. They allow commercial and derivative use. But even though anybody could download, all of Wikitravel and start republishing commercially, there was still obvious commercial value in it, such that they got acquired in 2006. I think it was 2006. Anyway, it could have been 2007. Where they were acquired by Internet Brands, which is basically a internet holding company that owns a whole bunch of different kind of niche automobile, different content sites that they advertise on, basically. Then the round trip thing is that Wikitravel Press was started by the founders of Wikitravel, who are now no longer with the company, using the content under the CC attribution share-alike license commercially, printing actual paper guides, which they hope to be competitive with Fodor's and Lonely Planet, et cetera. So one lesson that I get out of this is maybe community is the new quote-unquote intellectual property, in that the community is really the fulcrum that can't be replicated. Instead of using the law to say you can't copy this content, therefore you have to come to me, basically, if you cultivate the community, then even if the content is copyable, copying it's not really the content that's valuable, it's having the community around it that's continually developing the content. That's what's valuable. And if you own that website, basically, you can basically sell the website and the community goes along with it. That's basically what Wikitravel did. Of course, you have to be very careful about how you treat that community or it's going to blow up. And actually, Evan Prodromo, the guy who founded Wikitravel, has a fantastic talk on commerce and community and exactly how you should approach that. And I can give you the URL to that. But if you're thinking about pursuing this kind of business model, read what he has to say about it. One other indicator, Nine Inch Nails, you've probably all heard about this, released a quadruple album under a Creative Commons license. They had 1.6 million gross in their first week, all to them. 750,000 of that was in 2 days from selling a limited edition, ultra deluxe edition for $250 a pop. Or no, I can't remember what it was. I think it's $300 a pop, 250 copies, or vice versa. And this is all while the music is available legally under the CC license and easily. I mean, Nine Inch Nails was actually seeding different, or putting on different BitTorrent sites. And I don't think the non-commercial aspect is particularly important in this use case because nobody was licensing the music. I mean, in this initial time period anyway, they were just downloading the music. Although it could become an important factor because this is all instrumental, so it'd be great use in film. So maybe there will be a lot of commercial licensing for film. Who knows? Although in that case, it's possible that share alike would be enough because most filmmakers, unfortunately, don't yet want to release their films under free cultural license. So just some summary on those indicators. I'm just going to conjecture, which is what I've been saying all along, so maybe this is my bias anyway, that free culture is at least a decade behind free software. I'm going to say the exception is where there's mass collaboration. In other words, where it's a lot like software. And there it may rocket ahead. Wikipedia is an example of that. And the reason it could rocket ahead is because there just aren't a whole lot of adoption dependencies that software has. But in general, culture is much more varied than software, and success will be spiky. In other words, you can have a really blow-up success like Nine Inch Nails, but that, other than kind of the learning effects from that, that doesn't mean that doesn't directly help other culture releases succeed openly. Very briefly, I think there's a lot of ways that free culture and free software implementers, advocates, whatever, can collaborate. The knowledge and stories we build up in pursuing these practices, just a couple minutes, are mutually reinforcing. We're all learning how to make openness work better. So there's both kind of internalization of that knowledge, how to make it work, but also stories we spread that knowledge. And we also, more philosophically or politically or whatever, when people get a taste of freedom, basically we're creating demand for user autonomy. They say, why isn't this other piece of software or this other piece of content also free? So some specific problems to work on, that basically ones that affect both free software and free culture. There's open formats and maybe by extension software patents, because software patents are a lot of the reason why formats are a problem. There I'm thinking about things like codecs, and the Ziff Foundation is probably the most prominent organization doing work in this area. Free media creation tools, and also to some extent playback tools. Then there's the open media web. This is a term that Songbird likes to use, but basically to some extent that means open formats, but then also just publishing content on the web in a non-opaque way. another way of putting that is just give me a URL, allow me to dereference the URL and get the media. And that makes interoperability with free software much easier, and discovery in a very general way much easier, which means I just have kind of long tail artists using a CC license uploading my music. If they're doing it in a non-opaque way, then general discovery tools can find that. Whereas if you have people locked into silos like iTunes, then not only can free software not work with that, but there's also kind of a barrier to entry that is a barrier to entry for people publishing their free licenses to get into that silo. And then there's free culture distribution and discovery. Free culture helps free software in a lot of ways in that it's accessible to free software systems. That's one of the reasons you see Amarok and Rhythmbox building in access to Magnatune. Discovery is a huge problem for free culture in that basically big media has a nostalgia advantage. So building those discovery mechanisms into free software is an important thing. And then finally, just thanks to some organizations that are already doing some of this collaboration, including Free Software Foundation, Google, through funding, through their search, they allow you to find Creative Commons content. Mozilla, some of both, Red Hat, some funding and building media software. Songbird, some of the same. Wikimedia, really being a beacon for open formats and being a beacon for free culture, kind of in a way that Debian has been for free software. And I hope many more to come, including some of you. Then lastly, individually, even if you're not a coder or developer or a creator, I think the non-confrontational way to spread free software is to become an expert user of free software, and just so you'll be ready to help other users adopt. The same thing with free culture. Get to know and love free culture, and you'll be ready to recommend it. In other words, we have to eat our own dog food. That's a picture of canned dog food under CC license, and that's it. And if you're paying attention, that's a radio at the end, because I had a picture of a lug at the start. And sorry for probably going over time, but if there are any questions, I can probably take them offline or whatever. Okay, so I guess we will take questions anyway. Yeah, it tries to get as close to the public domain as possible, and the public domain depends on what jurisdiction you're in. But basically, it's hard to actually put new content in the public domain. Stuff can fall into the public domain because it's old or because it's a U.S. government work or whatever. But to be very clear that, especially outside the U.S., that we're not trying to say that new works are in the public domain in the same way, we decided we're going to create a clear separate brand to, if you want to approximate the public domain, this is how you do it. You have this waiver, which basically says, I'm trying to get rid of all of the rights that I possibly can, subject to the limits of law, so it will work worldwide. And one inspiration for this is what some people are doing on Wikipedia. Basically, they put a template on their user page that says, basically, I put my contributions to Wikipedia in the public domain, except where that might not be possible, I give away all rights possible. So,
do you know if anyone has actually tested the non-commercial stuff legally? Has there been any discussion?
Yeah,
in the courts?
there are a few cases involving CC licenses. One of them definitely involves non-commercial. Well, actually, it involved multiple aspects of the CC license. So Adam Curry, the former MTV VJ and podcaster, lives in the Netherlands. He had a picture of himself and his family, I guess, taken, or he took a picture, put it on Flickr under a Creative Commons license. I think it was a non-commercial license. It was used in a Dutch tabloid. which was obviously commercial use. It was actually without attribution as well, so it impacts multiple aspects and no notice of the license. And for whatever reason, they didn't apologize or anything, so he took him to court and won. And the court said, it's obvious that the license didn't grant the permission. Although I think the tabloid tried to say, well, it's under this license, that means we can do anything we want with it, which was obviously not the case. So
a question about attribution in a wiki context. If you're using that license and a document's gone through 100 different revisions, are there 100 different attributions?
Yeah, so we have a provision in the license since version 2.5, I think, that handles that case. Basically, collaborative work can say attribution must be given to the work or to the publisher instead of to each individual. And the two use cases for that were one for wikis and the other for some journal publishers really want to require work to go to, want to legally require attribution to go to the journal. So that.
So you talked about different strengths of the derivative works in software. Did I understand that your future licenses, you're thinking about making different strengths for share alike?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Are you thinking about making different strengths for the derivative work provisions in share alike in the cultural licenses?
I'm not sure what the question was. It's about the strengths of the aggressiveness of copyleft.
Are you going to make more than just a binary choice?
Oh, I see. Are we going to make it more than a binary choice? That's actually a really tough question. It's possible. In fact, it's been suggested, why don't we create a share-alike plus license, which would have stronger binding, basically. So that if you wanted that, then you could get that. The problem is that basically copyleft works bigger when you have one pool of copyleft content, so that it's all interoperable, because that basically gets the snowball building faster. That's one reason why I'm really keen, apart from working for Creative Commons, that's one of the reasons why I'm really keen to have the CC or Wikipedia move to attribution share alike, because that means that basically the massive copyleft content will be under one license, and hopefully snowball faster. So the problem with making those options is basically then you have kind of a bifurcation of that content. It's something that we might consider. I mean, another possibility is that we say that in cases where the linking is very close, like an illustration was actually created for an article, then it's then the binding's very tight. But if it's just kind of a photo of a flower that happens to be in a picture about spring, then not. So it could be it could be more of a fuzzy thing, which is basically where it's at now. But yeah, so it's a tough question, basically. Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks a lot.